Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And it's really exciting to see all of you after winter break. My name is Jill Greenwood. I am the Eric and J. Nord Family Curator of Education here at the Allen. And I would like to thank my colleagues who helped set up this event and also to the Guild for hosting the team. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Kevin Greenwood is the Joan L. Danforth Curator of Asian Art at the Allen. I was going to tell you highlights of past exhibitions, but the list was too long. So I will stick to the 4 current exhibitions: Inspirations, Global Dialogues Through the Arts, Shadows of Meaning, Echoes of Memory, works from the Zorinsky collection, Trickster Spirits, Demons, Foxes, and Tengu in Japanese Folklore, and finally, 8 Views, Places, Pictures, and Poems in East Asia. So since 2014, when he started here at the Allen, Kevin has been very successful in receiving grants for conserving art in the Allen's collection from the National Museum of Korea, as well as the Sumitomo and Carpenter Foundations. Most recently from the latter, to conserve the museum's 19th century incense burner with dragon base from the Meiji period in Japan, which is on view in the Stern Gallery, and it's spectacular. Kevin received his PhD at the University of Kansas. He met his great wife with research interests in art and Chinese imperial court of the 18th century, Buddhist art, Chinese painting, and East Asian contemporary art and garden architecture. Please join me in welcoming Kevin to present Imperialism, Architecture, and Oberlin, A Brief History of the Golden Temple.
Welcome. So great to see you all. Thanks so much for happy almost Valentine's Day. Thanks, of course, to the Guild for providing the cookies and the tea. Thanks to Jill for organizing this talk, and to Stacy Ross for publicizing it. I also want to thank Ken Grossi and Emily Redman in the archives for helping me access Oberlin's voluminous records on this topic. And thanks to Wendy Hyman and others in the Medieval and Early Modern Studies group for their comments on an earlier version. I hope you all find the topic of today's talk as fascinating as I do. Before I came here a decade ago, as part of my dissertation research on Chinese imperial architecture of the Qing dynasty, I ran across the story of how a Tibetan Buddhist temple made by the Qing court was replicated and put on display in a World's Fair in the 1930s, and then disassembled and kept in storage for decades at some college named Oberlin in Ohio. When I got the job at Oberlin in 2014, I found countless other curatorial priorities that have kept me busy for the last decade. But the story of the Golden Temple was always kind of floating out there as a potential subject, potential project like the Great White Whale or something like that. I kept building up a folder about the topic, and recently a visiting professor in religion, Kathy Lin, relit my interest in the topic, and I'm glad for this chance to explore some of the history with you today. I'll provide a list of sources in a slide at the end if you're interested. This talk moves through 3 sections and 3 historical periods. First, the Qing court in the late 18th century and how the original Golden Temple related to Qing imperialist ideology. Next, how the replication of the Golden Temple and almost accidental inclusion in the massive Chicago Century of Progress exhibition reflected America's growing global ambitions and conception of itself as an industrial and cultural power. Finally, we'll look at how the dreams to install the temple at Oberlin College were never realized and its current fate. Which of course brings us to North Korean political rallies. Okay, it's a bit of a leap, but bear with me. So these rallies in North Korea are probably the most extreme surviving example of a form of political expression that was much more common in the vocabulary of imperialism in earlier times. That is the overwhelming theatrical impact of spectacle. The spectacle was a major feature of the visual culture of imperialism. I think we're familiar with the iconography of the political spectacle, whether from ancient Rome, recreated here in the 17th century reimagining by English printmaker Basil Kent, and there's other great examples by Albrecht Dürer, which I don't think we have in the collection. Or more recently, in a kind of reimagining of Roman political spectacle by the Nazis, for example, at Nuremberg, or in Albert Speer's architectural designs for Hitler. Today, we really only see such spectacle on a regular basis in Olympic opening ceremonies, where the host nation gets a chance to dramatically highlight their cultural and historical ideals and achievements. In my opinion, one of the most effective recent uses of political spectacle for a global audience was the 2008 Beijing Olympics opening ceremony. How many of you have seen it or maybe remember it? If you haven't seen it, get on YouTube and watch it. It's, I don't know, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, but it's really, really fascinating to watch. But how can we think of these political spectacles as a form of visual expression? In the words of Guy Debord, the spectacle is the existing order's uninterrupted discourse about itself. It's laudatory monologue. It is the self-portrait of power in the epoch of totalitarian management of the conditions of existence. Our first case study looking at spectacle as a form of imperial discourse comes from China's Qing dynasty. To briefly highlight the period, it was China's last period of imperial rule. It was the strongest, the wealthiest, and most populous global state by the 18th century. It was multicultural and international, made up of not just Han Chinese people, but also Mongol, Tibetan, Manchu, and many other constituencies, but with an ethnic Manchu imperial family and ruling elite. The Qing court was no stranger to massive performative ritual spectacles like the contemporary ones that I just noted. Quoting Philippe Fauré, the notion of spectacle was essential to the Manchu enterprise. Massive processions were held not only in the imperial capital, but also in other spaces of the Qing Empire through imperial regional tours that demonstrated Qing military might and organization. But beyond the impressive but temporary displays of power seen in performances and processions, in the Qing period, there were more permanent forms of spectacle found in vast architectural and landscape garden palaces, which were used to convey the totality of Qing rule. Fauré, again, likens these spaces to stages for performance. Quote, imperial landscapes serve conceptually as the changing background of a theater stage. In fact, this architectural form of spectacle produced by the Qing court had less in common with the large public processions and rallies common to recent authoritarian and totalitarian states, and more in common with the 19th and 20th century World's Fairs and their descendants in the totalitarian vision of Walt Disney. In the idea of a creation of a kind of utopian fantasy space. These vast Qing dynasty theme parks were created for the private use of the emperor and special guests and recapitulated the Qing ideology of imperial universalism, the idea that the emperor was the legitimate ruler of all of humanity. These imperial theme parks or palace gardens utilized spectacle, but expressed it with two related concepts that we will focus on today. The first is microcosm, the creation of curated but reduced scale representation of larger entities. And the second, replication, reproducing faraway parts of the empire and beyond for the emperor's convenience, allowing him to embody his many roles. He argued that these spaces helped him better appreciate the diversity of his empire, but it probably simply demonstrated his dominance over it. The diversity that came from such a vast empire presented challenges for the ruling Manchu elite, namely how to rule the empire's diverse peoples and cultures. The emperor who did the most to articulate the strategy of such rule was the Qianlong emperor, who ruled for most of the 18th century. He expressed what I call the ideology of imperial universalism in words, particularly in large quantities of bad poetry, in art, in architecture, in ritual, all designed to legitimate the rule of the Manchu elite to the varied constituencies of the empire. He portrayed himself as everything to everybody in their own cultural, artistic, and linguistic idioms. One vast Qing palace garden that figures in our topic today is the summer retreat or summer capital in the town today called Chengde and located north of Beijing. The location was significant. It was beyond the Great Wall, demonstrating the Qing court's lack of fear of the northern tribal peoples, beyond the wall, because they in fact were northern tribal peoples originally. And they used the site as a place for diplomacy with the various groups of Mongols who were hesitant to come to Beijing due to the risk of smallpox, to which they had little immunity. The Mongol peoples were critical imperial constituencies as they always represented the greatest potential military threat to the Qing if they could unify as they did under Genghis Khan. The site is divided into two large parts, the mountain villa for escaping the summer heat and the 8 outer temples. To quote Philippe Fauré, again, who's written quite a lot about the site and why I keep quoting him, the summer capital formed a composite landscape that reproduced the map of the Manchu Empire. At Chengde, Qing monarchs contemplated their empire by observing a microcosmos that acted as a synecdoche for the entirety of their domains, end quote. The mountain villa has 3 parts, a palace district with courtyard after courtyard of palace buildings for audiences and residents, a garden district with theme buildings, plantings, and rockeries, and the prairie district for the Mongols to pitch their tents and have feasts and demonstrations of riding skills. But moving north outside of the villa walls are the 8 outer temples. And this is where the concept of replication really comes into play. Let me give a couple of other examples of the site before we get to the one that includes the Golden Temple. First is the Monastery of Universal Tranquility, or Puninsi. From 1755 to 1758, the Qing took advantage of a civil war among the Western Dzungar Mongols to conquer the region, and in the process killed 70 to 80% of the Dzungar population. The Dzungar genocide led to the Qing conquest of Outer Mongolia, Tibet, and the creation of the far western province of Xinjiang, that we hear about a lot in the news today, as a political and administrative unit. The monastery was built initially to provide spiritual aid and later to commemorate the war to defeat the Dzungar Khanate, and was built as a replica of Samye Monastery, the oldest and most sort of storied monastery in Tibet, founded in 779. Although from the exterior, it looks like a 5-story tower, in the interior is a vast empty space filled with a massive 93-foot-high sculpture of the Bodhisattva of compassion, the 1,000-armed Kamo. Another temple, the Blessings and Longevity of Sumeru Temple, was built to commemorate a special visit to court by the 6th Panchen Lama, who's like the number 2 Lama after the Dalai Lama, and was built as a replica of Tashi Lumpo Monastery in Tibet, the seat of the Panchen Lama. Sadly, the Panchen Lama contracted smallpox and during his visit and died, creating a bit of a diplomatic disaster for the court. If only they had vaccines, am I right? Finally, we come to the Potala of 1771, built as a replica of the Dalai Lama's palace in Lhasa, Tibet, and built to commemorate the emperor's 60th birthday and the emperor's mother's 80th birthday. I note that this year is my 60th birthday and a major birthday for my mother, who is in the audience, but I'm not building a big temple. I blame that on lifestyle choices. I wasn't on the emperor track in grad school. That's definitely a legacy admissions track. But back to the Potala. Even more significant and serendipitous, the opening celebrated the return of the Turgut or Kalmyk Mongol tribe who fled from Russia to join the Qing Empire. So that was a major PR coup for the Qing court. In this slide, we see a yellow box at the top indicating the location of a very important temple building. In the center of an interior courtyard is the All Dharmas Return to One Hall, Wanfaguiyi Pavilion, seen in this painting, commemorating a very important Buddhist ritual. In the center of an interior courtyard, oh, let me jump in, there we go, involving the Turgut Mongol leaders who are seen on the left and the Qing Emperor who's seen on the right. In classical Chinese political thought, groups of people coming to pay tribute or to join the empire willingly symbolize the legitimacy of the emperor's rule. So this was a big deal for the emperor. So this is what the site looked like in 2005, the last time I visited, and that is the roof of the hall. In 1994, the Mountain Villa and the 8 outer temples were added to the UNESCO World Heritage Site list, and the site has been beautifully restored by the Chinese government. worth a visit. So this is what what we're going to call the Golden Temple from here on out looks like. And then this is the interior of that space, elaborately, ornately decorated with sculptures and ritual objects. And an absolutely beautiful coffered ceiling with a corbelled dome and a bunch of dragons at the center. So let's move on to part two, the Golden Temple at Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition. In the 19th, early 20th century, as the Qing court declined, the site of the Qing summer retreat slowly deteriorated. This photo of the Potala at Chengde was taken by a scientific expedition that visited the site in 1930. And here's what the inner courtyard looked like. So very different from the restored version that we just saw. In June 1930, a team of specialists led by Swedish explorer Sven Hedin came to Chengde as part of what was called the Sino-Swedish expedition, a vast scientific and ethnographic survey of China. This part of the expedition was bankrolled by Vincent Bendix, a Swedish-American inventor and wealthy industrialist based in Chicago. The plan was to find 2 Chinese temples, ideally Tibetan Buddhist temples, in China that Hedin saw as great cultural monuments of humanity, but particularly at risk for loss. He intended to deconstruct these 2 temples, erect one in Chicago and the other in Stockholm. You can think of the project to preserve threatened works of architecture by taking them apart, shipping them to the United States. It's similar to the French monasteries and abbey cloisters that were taken apart and rebuilt as the Met cloisters in New York, or maybe the Egyptian Temple of Dendur, also in the Met. In the end, political sensitivities ended the plan to remove existing temples and shifted to making replicas. And the all dharmas returned to one hall, the Golden Temple, which came to be known as the Golden Temple, was selected for this project based on its status as an at-risk Tibetan Buddhist temple and its architectural reputation. Due to the complexities and expense, 2 replicas were reduced to 1 replica. During the winter of 1930-31, a team of 70 craftsmen in Beijing created a replica of the building, and here are some of the numbers to give you a sense of how complex the building was. However, after all of the components were shipped to Chicago in 1931, plans to erect it in Chicago's Lincoln Park were postponed indefinitely. But by storing this replica of a temple created as part of a Qing imperial microcosm in Chicago, it made the Golden Temple a convenient addition to yet another microcosm, Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition of 1933. In the late 19th, early 20th century, a popular venue for conveying the visual vocabulary of empire through the interplay of spectacle, microcosm, and replication was the International Exhibition, or World's Fair. The Great Exhibition in London in 1851 was the first, establishing the template of showcasing industrial and cultural achievements within vast exhibition spaces. World's Fairs functioned in part as microcosms of Western imperial power and progress. They often created carefully curated spaces where Western nations displayed their colonial possessions, technological advances, and cultural achievements, while simultaneously categorizing and ranking non-Western peoples and cultures through ethnographic exhibits and sometimes human displays. So here are the major fairs of the late 19th century, with the US fairs indicated in yellow. You'll note that the last was held in Chicago, 1893, the White City. If you read Devil in the White City, that's that fair. The fairs served multiple functions. They were simultaneously trade shows, museums, and amusement parks, in effect, democratizing the imperial microcosm. However, they still acted in part as propaganda vehicles that reinforced European imperial hierarchies by presenting Western civilization as the pinnacle of human achievement. This imperialist microcosm was physically manifested in the organization of exhibition spaces, where colonial pavilions and, quote, native villages were typically positioned on the periphery of the grounds, while host nation achievements occupied central prominent positions, literally mapping imperial power relationships onto the fairgrounds themselves. Here, for example, in the foreground, you can see Japan's Phoenix Pavilion, which displayed Japanese art treasures. As a rising imperial power, Japan used these fairs actually very effectively as a propaganda tool, but you'll note the peripheral status, the building in relation to the main hall. In the early 20th century, these fairs expanded in number and scope, with the United States hosting major fairs in 1904, 1915, and another in Chicago in 1933, the Century of Progress International Exhibition, which is our focus today. Designed as a celebration of the city's centennial, it was organized and held in 33-34 while the country was still in the midst of the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1939. Built on an area of roughly 427 acres, the entire site was built on reclaimed land on the shores of Lake Michigan and cost $37,500,000 in dollars of that time. That's roughly $850 million in 2025 dollars. Funding came from private sources, not government or city funds, and companies like General Motors and others sponsored large corporate pavilions and landmarks as marketing efforts. The fair provided a utopian vision of progress stemming from technology and industry. While ostensibly focused on scientific advancement, the fair reflected America's growing global ambitions and conception of itself as an industrial and cultural power. Like earlier exhibitions, the Century of Progress created a microcosm through strategic organization of national pavilions, cultural exhibits, and technological displays that reflected global power dynamics of the 1930s. Like other World's Fairs, it compressed global diversity into a walkable space where visitors could experience a curated version of world cultures, technologies, and commerce, though notably with more emphasis on future progress and less on colonial holdings than previous fairs, reflecting America's emerging role as a modern industrial power rather than a traditional imperial one. The exposition came at a pivotal moment when the US was transitioning from a nation that had historically been skeptical of European-style imperialism to one that would soon embrace its own forms of global influence, particularly after World War II. While not overtly imperialistic in the same way as earlier World's Fairs, the Century of Progress reflected and reinforced views of American exceptionalism that would later support US global hegemony. The world outside the US appeared in the fair's microcosmic vision, represented in ways that most often reflected American views of these places. Europe was a place of quaint, historic architecture, seen in sites like the Belgian Village, the streets of Paris, the Spanish Village, and Old Heidelberg. An exoticized and orientalized vision of the cultures of Asia was presented in spaces like the Oriental Village and the streets of Shanghai. In these spaces, the fair's central theme of technological and scientific progress masked underlying imperial and racial ideologies of the era and subtly reinforced colonial hierarchies. The Oriental Village and streets of Shanghai featured performers in traditional costumes, emphasizing what Americans viewed as the, quote, mysterious and ancient aspects of Asian cultures. Merchants sold stereotypical Oriental souvenirs, and restaurants served Americanized versions of Chinese cuisine. This commodification of Chinese culture reflected broader patterns of cultural imperialism. The fair's treatment of Asian cultures also reflected, honestly, growing American anxieties about Asian immigration and economic competition. These representations helped to reinforce racist immigration policies of the period, such as the continuing Chinese Exclusion Act and the more recent Immigration Act of 1924, by presenting Asian cultures as fundamentally other and incompatible with American society. Chinese American communities, to their credit, tried to challenge these representations, but their influence was limited by racial prejudice and political marginalization. But the building that made the most impact of all of these microcosmic cultural replicas, based on reports and records of the exhibition, was in fact the full-scale reproduction of the All Dharma's Return to One Hall, or the Golden Temple, made by the Sino-Swedish expedition and funded by Vincent Bendix. At the fair, it became known as the Bendix Lama Temple, or the Golden Temple of Jehol, which is another name of China. Bendix had connections with the fair's organizers, and with the plan to erect the Golden Temple in Lincoln Park on hold, he offered it to the fair. Fair officials accepted it and articulated its inclusion in a fair about science, industry, and progress as an example of advanced techniques of architectural reproduction, more than as a cultural site. A team of Chinese and American workers led by Guo Yanxi, seen here at the right, a Chinese architect educated in the US, did the construction. They completed the project in September of 1932 before the fair began. It was situated a bit off the main drive, just south of the Field Museum and Soldier Field. That spot is still empty, I would note. Is empty if they, anyway. The colorful and ornate exterior and interior were a huge draw for the crowds. Although most were attracted to the visual splendor and unfamiliar exoticism of the religious art. An attempt was made to interpret and explain for visitors the basics of Tibetan Buddhist practice and symbolism in a glossy souvenir pamphlet written by ethnographer Gustav Montel, a member of the Sino-Swedish expedition. We've got a copy of that in the archives if you're interested. However, ultimately, the Golden Temple was, for most American viewers, visually spectacular, but content-free. And this version made its way into popular culture, seen, for instance, as the backdrop to this 1933 advertisement for Nash. So let's turn now to our final section, Dreams for the Golden Temple. There's a lot in the Oberlin archives about this, but a good synthesis is former Professor Dale Johnson's unpublished essay that's listed in the sources at the end. I'll show you. The story begins with a very important historical figure, and 1906 Oberlin graduate, H.H. Kong, or Kong Shai-Shi, seen on the left as an Oberlin student, I think posing for an art class. Kong became the Minister of Finance for the Republic of China, was probably the wealthiest man in China of the period, and perhaps equally importantly, the husband of Song Ailing, who was one of the three Song sisters. The other two were married to Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, respectively. And they were powerful political figures in their own right. In the 1930s, Kong proposed a Chinese building for the college, a home for a proposed East Asian Studies department, and a symbol of the long connections between Oberlin and China through missionary activity and the Oberlin Shanxi Association. Kong pledged $2,000 or $3,000, which in today's terms would be about $50,000 for planning this project, and promised to secure further donations. Kong worked to raise funds, but there was hesitation about the project in the college administration due to the Great Depression. Back to the Golden Temple. After the Century of Progress concluded, the Golden Temple was sent to the New York World's Fair of 1939 and then warehoused in Flushing, Queens. Members of the Shanxi Association learned about the temple and expressed an interest in acquiring the temple for the Oberlin building project. They reached out to Vincent Bendix, who had bankrolled the Golden Temple, and he visited Oberlin. The temple was offered to the college for $1. And this was on around September 1st, 1943. However, President Wilkins was reluctant and not committed to the project, but he agreed to it under pressure from the trustees. His preference was for a modern Chinese building, not, in his words, quote, a temple of a debased form of religion that would be a repudiation of the efforts of Oberlin's missionary. The Board of Trustees voted to approve the project in July 1943, and H.H. Kong donated $75,000 at the time, which is about $1,365,000. In 1943, 18 boxcars arrived in Oberlin with all of the parts of the Golden Temple, and they were stored in a local warehouse. A model of the temple accompanied the crates, and it was set up at the Allen Museum in the King Sculpture Court right out here, as you can see. Discussions began about how to use the temple. Ideas included a Center for Far Eastern Studies, art department offices, a gallery for the art museum, or offices for the Oberlin Shanxi Memorial Association that was so crucial in getting it there. In March of the next year, 1944, President Wilkins created 4 academic chairs in Far Eastern languages and literature, art, history, and religion. And in November, the Department of Far Eastern Studies was established. After considering a few other spots on campus, a final plan situated the temple in the space between the Allen and the first hall auditorium, earlier version of the hall auditorium. And in October of 1944, a groundbreaking ceremony for the project was held. Here's that space today. The checkerboard Robert Venturi design wing wasn't added until 1977, so this was a large space at the time, appropriate both for the temple and a surrounding Chinese-style garden. However, unfortunately, World War II delayed the project due to lack of building materials, and even after the war, construction was continually postponed over and over, and costs continued to rise. Finally, in 1949, Oberlin requested the Chicago Trust to release the college from the obligation to construct the temple. And H.H. Kong asked for his money back, which was done in 1950. So for decades after that, the temple remained in storage in Oberlin, stuck in what Tibetan Buddhism refers to as the bardo, between death and rebirth. In 1950, Harvard Yenching Institute expressed interest in the temple. Ownership was transferred. They refused to pay the insurance fees and backed out in 1958. In 1962, the first Kalmuk Buddhist temple of Freewood Acres, New Jersey. These were descendants of the Torgut people who the building was dedicated to in its original form. They requested that the temple be given to them, and they acquired title in 1963. But in the end, they couldn't raise enough funds to re-erect it. In 1969, ownership passed to Indiana University, but the person spearheading the fundraising effort died. It goes on. In the late 1970s, University of Chicago mounted a campaign unsuccessfully. And also in the late 1970s, a group from Chicago Chinatown pursued the temple, but the project leader fell ill and the project withered. Meanwhile, in Oberlin, the temple languished in storage, and eventually the warehouse itself deteriorated. In 1982, local scrap dealers, Paul Herring and Fred Fagan, falsely claimed to represent Indiana University. They gained access to the temple in storage and looted the copper roof shingles, selling them for scrap. They also stole some of the painted wooden panels. In 1984, the theft was discovered during a visit by Max Wohler from the Ethnographical Museum in Stockholm. He discovered both the theft and that the warehouse roof had collapsed. And he also found out about the looting and sued Herring successfully. Wohler gained title on behalf of the Sven Hedin Foundation in Stockholm, and ownership was transferred. The remaining pieces were shipped in 1985 and 1986 to Stockholm. Ownership was then transferred to the newly created Golden Temple Foundation with plans to rebuild the temple in Stockholm. The model, the bell, and other objects from the interior ended up in the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm, where they remain. Most recently, in 2023, the Golden Temple Foundation filed for bankruptcy. And a Swedish-Chinese buyer purchased the remains and shipped them back to China, where they remain with plans to rebuild them there. And that's where the story stands now, going out with a bit of a win. So in the end, the ill-fated Golden Temple project is remembered here at Oberlin by a handful of us, I think, as a fascinating moment in Oberlin history. In most of my discussions about the project, people tend to look back upon it wistfully, dreaming of what might have been. But I'm starting to wonder what the status of the temple might be today if it had been successfully erected in 1943. The closest analog, I think, is the Weltheimer Johnson House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, that the museum manages. It is an historic building made by an architect known for great designs, but often problematic engineering. Despite the best efforts of the museum, it has provided a lot of challenges for the college to maintain. It is frankly underutilized, only open to the public one Sunday a month, and not in the winter because the heating doesn't work. I am very happy to report a recent large donation, thank you, for roof repair and other overdue projects. But one can only imagine the challenge of funding and attention had to be divided between two historic and largely ceremonial. So to conclude, let's use this quick and dirty Photoshop image to imagine for a moment that the building had been erected on campus. The temple might have exemplified the long-term relationship between Oberlin and China and symbolized the contributions toward international understanding of this relationship. The building may have become significant as representation for Asian American communities on campus and in the region. It also might be another building on campus whose style suggests the cosmopolitanism and global reach of Oberlin College. In essence, no different from appropriating Tuscan and French Renaissance architecture and interior design for this building, the 1917 museum building. But on the other hand, what might be the critique of the Golden Temple on Oberlin's campus? After the revolution in 1949 and the US anti-communist attitudes throughout the 1950s, how would such a prominent Chinese building have been received by potential students and the wider community in rural Ohio? What about today's political climate, not just in relation to the mostly right-wing and populist-driven anti-China sentiment, exemplified, I think, by the TikTok ban, but also left-wing critiques of cultural appropriation and cultural imperialism? The very idea of rebuilding a Chinese temple, even a reproduction, at an American college campus reflects certain imperial assumptions about the right to relocate and recontextualize cultural artifacts, a practice that cannot be separated from broader imperial networks and power relations. The Oberlin missionary connection is particularly significant here. Oberlin had deep ties to missionary work in China since the 19th century, and the idea of bringing a Chinese temple to campus would have aligned with the complex relationship between missionary education and cultural imperialism. Missionary colleges often saw themselves as bringing the light of Western civilization and Christianity to other cultures while simultaneously appreciating but also appropriating elements of those cultures. And the Golden Temple at Oberlin would have been a very public example of that broader pattern. So the question is, how would an American-funded reproduction of an imperial Manchu Tibetan Buddhist temple made in northern China, exhibited at World's Fairs with their cultural imperialist associations, be received on campus today? In the end, in thinking about the fate of the Golden Temple and the fact that the reconstruction project at Oberlin never came to fruition, I'm reminded of the Chinese idiom, "Yanzhi faithful," right? Who's to say whether or not it's a blessing?